Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you direct from Yokohama, Japan, where it's very early in the morning. So I hope that wherever you are, you're wide awake. I'm certainly trying to be. I know I will be because we have a conversation with Tim Wilson today. So I'm going to tell you all about that in a second. But first, I want to welcome you, of course, to the Philanthropy Mastermind series brought to you by our friends at DonorSearch, who have been sponsoring this series since 2016, and we have about 500 sessions we've done with all different sorts of folks on a wide range of topics, and you can learn all about that over on the site at DonorSearch, which is at donorsearch.net. Under the resources tab, you'll see CFRE accredited programs and recordings of conversations like the one we're about to have, as well as our podcast, which is really for the ear, on the lives of people in the field of philanthropy and fundraising. And that's a good segue actually for our guest today, Tim Wilson, who has a podcast, which I know you will want to listen to. So we'll probably be bringing that into the conversation very soon as well. But what I'd like to do first is just say hello to Tim. So hi, Tim.
Hi, Jay.
Thanks very much for doing this, and direct out of a campaign meeting. So thank you for making the time. I appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here today.
No, it's an honor to have you. And if you don't mind, I want to introduce you a little bit. And then I know you have some content to share with us on the topics that we're supposed to be talking about today. And we may go beyond that. And I want to welcome the folks who are here with us live. Because some will be live and some will be recorded later. And people will be listening after the fact to engage with us. And you can do that either through the chat. Feel free to do that. In fact, I would encourage you right now, as a courtesy to Tim, to just open up your chat and say hello. That would be a very nice thing to do. And we'd love to know that you're here, where you're from, what you're up to. We'll try to integrate all that stuff that we hear in the chat into our conversation today. We also have a Q&A. Which is, of course, for questions and answers. And we're going to be doing that. So do use the Q&A if you want to make sure we don't miss what you're asking about. Use the chat for yourselves, and hopefully we can make sure we're keeping an eye on that as well. Now, today's subject, as you probably know, unless you're just here because you want to hear Tim and stop hearing from me in a second, is mastering prospect development in a changing tech landscape. There's a lot to chew on in that title. And among the things that Tim said that he would be willing to talk about are continuous learning, overcoming imposter syndrome, harnessing new tools like AI for effective prospect development. There's a lot in that, but there's more to not only Tim's work, but the things he thinks about. And you may know that because of running into his People in Fundraising podcast, running into him in his work that he's done through the NEDRA board, or his work with Apra International on the online content committee, or serving as President of Apra Utah, or in any of his professional roles, going from Harvard Business School, Intermountain Healthcare to today at Weber State University. So lots, of course, of his experience will be informed in what he's going to share with us in a second. But once again, we want this to be also a conversation with you. So I'm going to try to step aside for a second. So Tim, you can share a little bit, and then we'll have a great conversation, hopefully weave the others into that. So take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jay, for that thoughtful introduction. And I see there's people from my native New England joining us, and Canada as well, and across the country. So I'm just very grateful to be here today, and honored that people across the industry and across geographies know about you and the work that you do. And one of the topics as Jay teed up, I was going to talk about is imposter syndrome. And I feel that I'm kind of feeling that way right now. As Jay mentions, 500 interviews in the DonorSearch Philanthropy Mastermind series. That's amazing, and a testament to the work you do and the passion you have for nonprofit work, Jay. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, so as Jay mentioned, there's a lot to cover in the topic today. I've worked in prospect development for almost 25 years. And like many people in the industry, in the prospect management and research sector, at least, I would say that I regard myself as more of an operational generalist, a jack of all trades, as opposed to someone who really niches down and focuses on one particular aspect of prospect development, whether that's strategy or data analytics and such. So that's kind of my very general background. And specifically, I've worked on heavily reactive research teams, large teams, small teams, managing a team, and now I'm a team of one at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah. And another thing that Jay and I would love to talk about today is harnessing or leveraging artificial intelligence for effective prospect development. And I just wanted to share one quick anecdote from my current employer, Weber State. I contacted our information security team recently and said, I've looked on the website. I don't see any guidelines or policies about staff members using ChatGPT on the OpenAI platform, and B, can I use my employer email address for that, or do you prefer that I use my personal? And their response is still pending. So just a kind of a testament to the really fast-paced nature of artificial intelligence, the impact that it's already having. I think a lot of people in the nonprofit world, some of the research I've done in preparation for today talks about a lot of general awareness of artificial intelligence and how it may impact philanthropy in general, as well as down to the specific jobs. But sort of we're at kind of, in some shape, we're at more of a theoretical state, unless you're a massive university or our healthcare system, where there is more down in the weeds practical application. So Weber State and my job fall more right now into that theoretical awareness, learning and reading, but not applying those tools at this point. And so if some of the attendees today are in that same camp, welcome, and you're not alone. How does that sound, Jay?
Sounds excellent. Sure.
Yeah.
Now, I know that you talked about possibly sharing some visuals with this. You're welcome to do that, Tim.
Okay.
If you want, I just made the sharing available.
Sure. So, a couple things here. In terms of the mastering of prospect development in a changing tech landscape, I wanted to share this quote from a book that came out last year from Nathan Chappell, Brian Crimmins, and Michael Ashley. I actually interviewed Nathan and Brian for my People in Fundraising podcast. And the crux of their book is about, as societies, as professions become more automated and people are on their screens more often, we are losing sort of that human element, human connection, conversation, and we're seeing drastic trend lines, not in a good way in terms of the ripple effect of that on philanthropy, where a lot of nonprofits are still seeing significant gifts, but they're coming from a much smaller donor prospect pool. And in their book, The Generosity Crisis, one of the strong suggestions for nonprofits is a reframing of how we engage with our donors to combat that lack of connection, the dwindling connections. And I loved this. This is toward the end of their book. I see this as a real application in prospect development, and I wanted to share that. It's sort of the second quote here. In the nonprofit economy, this reframing, going from the transactional to a more radical way of connecting with donors, happens when leaders stop asking major gift officers and prospect development people how much money is in your portfolio, and instead vice presidents, directors ask, how deep are the relationships in your portfolio? I've tried to apply this mindset as I meet with my gift officers. I currently support about 10 development directors at Weber State, broken up by colleges. And this is where I think artificial intelligence can really help move the needle, because as nonprofits clean up their data and put in more engagement data, invited to an event, attended an event, registered, clicked on, marketing, all those engagement touch points can be utilized by artificial intelligence tools to help get at that reframing of the question about how deep are the relationships in your portfolio. And so I'm excited for that. At Weber State, we're currently about 3 months removed from going to a new CRM advanced database. One of the significant challenges with nonprofits adopting artificial intelligence tools is a lot of the data is just not clean. That's a function of human error, limitations, certainly resource allocations. And so as we try to clean up the data, the better data points we can put into the system related to activities and engagement, the better the modeling and automation can be, so that we are able to get a better sense of how deep are the relationships, who knows who, and that can help us to address this generosity crisis. Any questions or thoughts from Jay or the audience on that?
I'm not seeing anything on that right yet. So just jump right ahead.
Awesome. So one thing that I've felt would be important to share, and I've had this from a few guests in my People in Fundraising podcast, which I launched 1 year ago. To date, most of my guests have been either from the frontline staff side or the prospect development side. And Ruthie Giles is a terrific thought leader in prospect development in Western Massachusetts, on the NEDRA board and very active in our community. And when I talked with her last fall, she made the case that prospect development is really the hub of advancement work. But too often, and this has been true in my case too, our teams have been slotted with operations, finance, alumni, information technology, advancement services, and there's nothing inherently mistaken about those organizational slots. At Weber State, I currently report to a director of development, so I'm attached to the major gift team. On my hybrid schedule, the days I'm in the office, I'm actually sitting closer to advancement services. So I like that sort of hybrid within the hybrid, where I'm closer in proximity to our data analyst and the director of advancement services. So, you know, every shop is different, but I think trying to promote ourselves in prospect development as strategic partners, Utah State University, their vice president and my counterpart there, Rachel Richards, view the prospect development team as fundraisers. And I loved hearing them talk about that, because prospect development is not viewed as back office or, hey, can you just Google this and send me something on a prospect. It really is a nice relationship up there in Logan, Utah. So where we're sitting is key. Apra University has been a phenomenal resource for me in terms of continuous learning. And for members of our audience today, if you are a member of Apra International, this is a terrific resource. Jay wanted me to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome. And for me, I'll stop the slideshow here for a moment. I would say that imposter syndrome has been manifested in my career in lots of ways. And I just wanted to share that kind of candidly with our audience in the spirit of, again, like, you're not alone if you feel this way. So for me, imposter syndrome has been, who am I to launch a podcast? You know, I'm a prospect development person. And I think looking at people like Jay and Jen Filla and other veterans of the fundraising landscape, I thought, man, I'm nowhere close to them in terms of tenure, in terms of expertise, but I did it anyway. And I think that is, at least in my professional and personal life, that has worked well at times. It's just to say, you can do it too. And it does not have to be the same format. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just do it anyway. And I think the fruits of getting over imposter syndrome, at least in that sense, is seen today, where Jay invited me graciously to this conversation. So that's one way of just saying, I've got an idea, I want to see where it goes, and kind of being the boss of your own destiny in that sense. And that's how I've tried to overcome imposter syndrome. Another way is feeling that when I was, and Jay mentioned I served on the NEDRA board. NEDRA is one of the largest regional chapters of Apra International. And I was asked a couple of years ago before I moved to Utah, and I thought, man, if you look at the people on the board, they've been in the field forever. They're active on Prospect L, and they've had successive roles and responsibilities at various universities. And again, I was like, I'm on a reactive research team, and I've been there for a long time. And who am I? I mean, what could I contribute? But again, just saying like, okay, that's my imposter syndrome. I don't belong, but someone else felt that I had something to give. And so saying yes to that has been a really eye-opening and very rewarding experience for me.
Tim, I don't want to stop you from going through other things you may want to share, but if you don't mind, I'd love to dig into this with you a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have two reactions to this, and I wonder if they're common or not. One is that when you say that you have this, I believe you. But then others listening to you and then looking at your background, you run a shop now at a university. You were at a major health center and doing that work. You served on the NEDRA board. You're serving on this major committee, educating the field. And, you were at Harvard Business School for all those years. So, I mean, I'm not sure if that's who you're describing as reactive or not. We won't say. But what I am going to say is that's a big place. And Harvard's a big place that rages the biggest campaigns. They just raised close to $11 billion. So I guess my reason for saying this is, I wonder if we all feel, or most of us feel like we're not really up to the task. And then when we hear another person say it, and then we look at their background, we think, well, yeah, but look at what they've done.
Yes, absolutely. That's spot on, Jay. So,
the one thing that you've done to counter that is just to go ahead and do the thing that you want to do, which is terrific advice. But I'm sure you've also talked to people, especially through the podcast, and have found different ways that people have approached this issue. Because one of the things that I think is really amazing about your podcast is you're not just focusing on the same old, same old. And with all due respect, all those people get interviewed a lot or have a new book or do some consulting gig. You're talking to a lot of people who are earlier in their career and giving them a stage to talk about their work and their life, which I think is remarkable. So are you running into this kind of concept of imposter syndrome with some of them? And if so, how are they dealing with themselves?
That's a great question, Jay. I would say that, as you mentioned, some of them are early to mid-career themselves, and I think they exhibit imposter syndrome, thinking, well, Tim had these authors of the generosity crisis on, or people on the NEDRA board. Amy Lampy, who co-authored a book with Josh Burkholz last year on benefactors, she was on to talk about her book. And so I think there definitely have been some guests who, when I reach out to them, and maybe you experienced this with your outreach to your guests too, it's like, I don't belong. Like, look at the people that Jay has had or Tim has had, or getting back to those affiliations, volunteer affiliations. But they do it anyway, and they've seen the videos, because it's audio and visual for my people in fundraising. And, this is nothing spectacular. This is not a professional background. I'm in my basement, and this is where I record. This is my studio. And I think that vulnerability and that human connection helps them to feel comfortable and to feel like they have something important to share. And I try to tip them off to that when I interview them. I'm a prospect researcher by trade. So I try to find, hey, Jay, you've posted about this topic. I'd love to invite you on because I've been thinking about what you said. And that's sort of a lead to my invitation to them, so that it's not an invitation out of the blue. And that has been helpful, I think, for a lot of my guests to feel like, okay, Tim sees something of value in how I think about how our industry is changing, or something about my background.
I'd love to see if people are willing to do it, to post something in the chat about whether or not this is something you've experienced. And that you can post anonymously if you don't feel like doing it under your own name. We won't name check you here, but I think it'd be helpful to know, is imposter syndrome something that you've experienced, and how have you dealt with it? I think that's something that's probably healthy for us all to discuss, especially in the field of prospect development, which is that a transmogrification of prospect research? I don't know. I mean, as the field develops, we call it by different names as it changes and evolves. But there are a lot of people who came to this field, especially early on, where they were in something entirely different, like library sciences or what have you. And then they went into this. And so they felt like, well, can I really do this? Well, their skill set's terrific. And probably in some respects superior to that of many of their colleagues. I mean, at least in terms of being able to access, understand, and utilize information, which is kind of core to fundraising. So it'd be interesting just to see if other people are encountering this. There's another part with your podcast I'm curious about. So it's one thing to say, okay, I haven't done this before, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it, which is what you did. There's another part that once you're doing it, though, some of us might do it, but we might hesitate about certain things we do with it. And I've run into that a lot personally. For example, I haven't, tried to contact Darren Walker. And I'd love to interview Darren Walker. I think a lot of us would love to interview, somebody like, I'm trying to think. Mackenzie Scott is the greatest example. So here's my question for myself, and definitely for you. When it comes to something like that, do you hold back, as I hold back? And if so, why? And how do we overcome that? Why am I doing this thing?
I definitely hold back. And I think, and Jay, when you invited me to this conversation, I think the other important element is curiosity. You know, we're both naturally curious people, and we've found a profession and skills to develop and enhance that, married with our curiosity, has been very enriching. And I think for me, I do hold myself back from certain people because, again, I think, you know, why would they, you know, make time for me? This is nothing spectacular and professional. It's not A&E biography with a production team. But I do feel that sometimes when I get, you know, authors on, I then try to say, hey, you know, as I reach out to another guest, these people have been on the program recently talking about this topic. Whether it's on Prospect L, the Apra International thread for conversation and questions, or elsewhere. I've noticed you've been active in this conversation as well. And that helps. But there are still times where I just think, oh, yeah, I would love to have the guest on, but something holds me back. And sometimes it's the guests themselves, and that's totally fine as well. Like, just human nature, you have to respect people. They're not comfortable being on video talking.
Yeah. I've run into that too. And sometimes some people, you know, they might be thinking about, well, how many views or listens or whatever it is do you have before they do something, and maybe they will respond accordingly, or maybe we don't ask them because of those things. We're afraid of that they may want those things that we think we can or cannot offer. It's a strange thing, and you know this well, but a lot of people don't, which is that the world of doing something from your basement, or in my case, this is from a hotel room, that this is very common, actually. So I don't know, you're probably closer to it than I am, but I don't know that either of us are influencers, right? I mean, I'm not selling a new bar of soap or a fashion item anytime soon. But at the same time, what we have in common with them might be that first, they've done what you have done. They've just went ahead and did it. And secondly, that they will just forge forward, perhaps out of their basement, creating content and building an audience for that content. But here, of course, you're doing it in a way that jives with what you were talking about earlier, which is this whole thing with continuous learning, which also seems to counter the fear. You've been swimming the pond of NEDRA with APRA and all the rest of this, both in higher ed and in healthcare. I'm wondering if, again, you see ways that we can encourage more people to be able to raise their hands, because that seems like one thing that's been a perpetual component of this field of prospect development. A lot of people sitting back a bit, maybe because they are analytical and they're just trying to gather all that information, understand, learn, and then respond rather than just responding immediately. But ultimately, it's going to be helpful to hear their voices. So in addition to the podcast, what other ways are you seeing for people to encourage people to raise their hands in our field?
That's a great question. And I would start to answer that by sharing something that Jen Filla of the Prospect Research Institute shared with me. She interviewed me about 3 months ago, and then I interviewed her, and her interview will be posted later this spring. And Jen said, quote, having a lot of voices in prospect development out there is really important. So for me, whether that takes the form of the podcast or serving on APRA committees, that at this point in my career is really important. It's very fulfilling as well. The trick is, and this may be why we're talking about the hesitancy of other and more voices to join, is balancing all that with your day-to-day responsibilities with family, education, a spouse or a partner and their life circumstances as well. Like, it does take, concentrated balancing so that you're meeting your obligations. You're also not getting burned out. And I think that may be why we see a nice, trusted, small community of people that are very active with sharing content, generating content, writing books or articles, serving on boards. And we're not yet seeing, more of a wave of prospect development people coming to shore as well. And I think in my experience, I've seen that at the Apra international level, all the way down to podcasting, serving on the small Apra Utah board. We had a real hard time last year trying to get new voices to serve on the board. But I think it's very important to make time to tell prospective volunteers, this is the time commitment. This is the general nature of what we do, how we operate. This is the why we do this, to give back. And one thing I've seen that's been very helpful is having them shadow, at a board meeting, or giving them some training documentation and saying, this is what it is, and there's a lot of, I'm thankful, there's a lot of people in the chat also sharing that they have felt imposter syndrome,
as well as the reasons and that hold them back. And by holding back, I just mean making choices perhaps that are to the advantage of their family life or the rest of their work life, and that sometimes precludes some of these other activities we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that myself. My wife and I have 4 kids, they go from 16 to 9, and I burned out about 3 months ago from the podcast and stepped back, and I think that was very necessary.
You just need a member of your family working with you. There's somebody in the background here who's working with me, and he's on another continent right now. But no, in all seriousness, do they come into your undisclosed location, your basement podcasting studio?
They have not yet. In fact, there's a lock on the door to my left, to my
really?
right.
So actually, and I'm joking around here, but having those, determining where those lines are with you and colleagues, with you and family and things like that, to enable you to take on a new project or undertake a podcast or whatever it is, that's probably pretty important too.
It is. And in fact, when I had the podcast idea, I went to my manager proactively and said, here are my guardrails. I'm not going to use my Weber State laptop, my Weber State email account. I'm going to use all my personal stuff to do the podcast. And my manager at the time appreciated that. So just one example of guardrails.
And that's great, because you set your own guardrails and then you checked it with them. This is actually a great practical piece of advice, because in many environments, maybe they haven't even discussed this stuff, sort of like the ChatGPT, which we're also talking about. If there's no policy in place, then I guess if you want to do the thing, you invent the policy.
Yes. Yeah. And that brings up, when you mentioned ChatGPT, Jay, this may be a good time to dive into that part of the slide deck, if that's okay.
Please.
I'm happy to share the slide deck with attendees and registrants. It's a little light on content purposefully, because I wanted it to be more about the conversation, a nice flow. For me, I mentioned curiosity. So I'm naturally curious about a lot of things, but at kind of the midpoint of my career, it's reining in that curiosity so I can focus on what I need to do and learn for my job, whether that's donor strategy, portfolio maintenance, and then applying that focus and the reading I do to my main responsibilities in prospect development. Here are some resources that I think have been very helpful for me as I learn. And I also think, like, I would love to see, whether that's within prospect development or in philanthropy in general, more appreciation and support for reading about content, taking time in your workday to read about content, and less or slightly less emphasis on generating content and replying to content in email, Slack, whatever channels we use. I think, in my experience, and I've seen it from other fundraising professionals, if someone walks by your cubicle or a conference room and you're reading a book or a stack of documents, for some people that does not register as they're working, because they're not in front of a computer. They're not generating content, whether that's a research bio or a marketing piece, but they are doing what could be misconstrued as leisure. So I think with how that dovetails with leveraging AI is we all need to become more familiar with the fast nature of these technical developments. And some of that has to be done during the workday. And that's, I think, in my opinion, that's totally okay. So that's my little hill to die on, advocating for more time to read about content and not just generating it. Some recent headlines I pulled together.
Tim, actually, I don't know if you mean to be showing a slide right now. We can't see it.
Oh, sorry. I will share that. Thank you. Yeah, I would say here are some recent headlines that I pulled together in preparation for today. And this gets into, I mentioned a few minutes ago, so the curiosity piece that a lot of us bring to our jobs, why we gravitated to frontline, because we love talking to people and matching passions with needs, or why we gravitated to prospect development because, as Jay mentioned, you mentioned earlier, library science or other backgrounds that we saw a natural skill set to get into prospect development. So this is my broad sweep curiosity that I read about. And these are all from within the last month or so, about artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. The dichotomy between it's going to be a utopia and it's going to be a dystopia. That's all good to be aware of. This is the one that I feel most afraid of, and I would caution you not to read this like right before bedtime. It kept me up when I read this last night. Never give artificial intelligence the nuclear launch codes. But the other great thing about trying to read for awareness and applying it is just this, it's so new. This artificial intelligence, these tools are so new that there are a lot of opinions out there about how we can apply it. So again, this is kind of the big picture. It's not the end of the work, it's the end of boring work. That a lot of the rote responsibilities in our jobs can be automated, freeing us up to do more engaging work with your, if you're a frontline fundraiser, engaging with prospects and donors more in prospect development, automating processes. There's a headline here: abandon all hope, ye who merge spreadsheet cells. But these incredible changes will help reframe how we do our work in nonprofits. I would totally encourage people to read this article. And let me see. This was by Catherine Flatten, who works at BWF. Prospect Development in a Changing Landscape, Adapting Ethical Practices for the Future. This came out recently. It's a 5-minute read. Catherine mentions that the headline, but not the body of the text, was generated by artificial intelligence. So if you work in prospect development in particular, but for those who work with prospect development officials, leaders, also worth a 5-minute allocation of your time. I won't read this whole quote from Catherine from that article, but it talks about the role that prospect development nonprofit leaders have to take on in terms of setting privacy regulations, enforcing policies for ethical data, how we capture it, how we store it, how we share it. So I think we're really at there's a quote here from Winston Churchill: "Now is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning," as artificial intelligence becomes more prevalent, not just in our personal lives, but also in our professional lives too. Also, this article from 2022 from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, it's about 15 pages. Several thought leaders contribute to it. There's a link to it in the slide deck that I'm happy to share. So again, I would encourage people to read that. So that's where I'm at in terms of leveraging artificial intelligence at this point. And I think a lot of my prospect development peers are at that same stage where they've used ChatGPT to rewrite their LinkedIn bio or bio on a donor. Other prospect development friends have said, we don't have any policy, and therefore I'm leaning into privacy and my own personal professional hesitations to not use it yet. So I think there are a lot of different stances, viewpoints, feelings about this right now. And certainly we are looking for perhaps governmental, institutional, employer, and even APRA or AHP guidelines, policies, regulations, and those are all in various forms of forthcoming. So I think it's an exciting time. It can also feel unnerving because it's really unknown. But I think one thing that helps me is just general reading and then seeing what fits. You know, here's the actual Chronicle of Philanthropy piece. So reading this morning again, and taking away some things that I can share with my own manager. So again, that's that curiosity that I then try to rein in to focus on how I can apply it to my job.
As you're talking about this, a couple things strike me. But before I ask that, I want to, again, poll the audience to borrow a phrase from the old Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And that's to ask them if they are using, if anybody here in the room with us is using any form of AI. And the reason I'm asking is because, well, there are a couple of things. First, sometimes we're using it without knowing that we're using it, but this is intentional use. At some conferences, in fact, Nathan Chappell talks about this. He's one of the authors, as you said, of that Generosity Crisis book, and is building the AI tools over at DonorSearch. And he talks about how he's gone to conferences a lot recently with the book, and he will poll the audience in a room full of fundraisers. And there's a lot of interest in all of these tools, but then only maybe 2% of the people in the room are actually using them or aware of using them. So if you're using this stuff, we'd love to know. So again, in the chat, if you want, just let us know. Are you using any of these tools? How are you using them? And then, Tim, my question for you is whether or not an organization has it in practice right now. Like you've been thinking about it, but you're kind of looking at it conceptually more than you are, okay, how are we going to use this tool tomorrow to do X? You're in a place now where you are a team of one. You've been in places where there was an army. And in both of those environments, you probably would look at a new tool and have to do an assessment, and then have to develop a policy for the use of that tool. Because all research data is potentially fraught, right? I mean, some of it is very useful for us, but would be beyond the pale. I think about things like years ago, because I'm old. Years ago, we would talk about Social Security numbers. And today, people would say, well, how could you possibly have that kind of information? On old SEC forms, it's there. And so you could use that if you were a university and you had the Social Security numbers to exact match people on a Form 4. Anyway, so then fast forward, because you can't do that anymore, thankfully. And today, people talk about things like the use of political donation data. Of course, you can use it for research, but the statutes might be interpreted to say you can't use it for prospecting. Two different things, even though the data is all available to us and it's all free. And then now APRA itself is looking very closely, of course, at diversity-related issues, as it should be, as a matter of policy, right? And one of the issues there is, well, sure, we want to know how do people identify so that we can be thoughtful and sensitive and be thinking forward to make sure that every way we think about our constituents is with reference to how they see themselves, not how others see them. Well, that sounds great. But if you build a database full of information now about ethnicity and things of that nature, that's pretty specific. So we have to think about that as a matter of policy. This is a long-winded way of asking you a question, which is on stuff like this, and now it's artificial intelligence. Where do you start? How do you determine what's right, what's wrong? And then how do you write a policy and get other people to go along with it? Because most of the people outside the office don't even have that knowledge. They haven't read all those articles you just showed us.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, Jay. I think, for me, it is, it's taking the time, which is why I advocate that we read during our workday. Read these things. 5 minutes. This was probably a half hour of reading, synthesizing salient points. I've got it very well marked up. And again, these are from various thought leaders in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I think Sarah Landman organized the full document. It's following people on LinkedIn for me as well that talk about these topics. And I take screenshots, I print out some documents, bring it to my manager and say, here are the highlights. I'm not expecting you to read, a 30-page document or a 15-page document, but here are the biggest takeaways for me, and this is how I see they can apply to even just starting to think about it before we do anything. I think these should go into a guidebook. Let's meet in a month. Let's meet at the end of the quarter. Let's review this because it's going to fluctuate dramatically, even in that little bit of time. There was one of the headlines I shared that said, ChatGPT is already obsolete. Again, that's an opinion. I don't have the expertise to know that for a fact, but that just speaks to how quickly, the pace of how quickly these developments are changing.
By the way, we've got great comments in the chat once again. So if you're here with us and you're not reading it, take a look over there. It's really cool. Plus, Tim has included a link there. And Jack, thank you, Jack, has also included some links referring to some of the things that Tim has been talking about. So I hope those are helpful to you. If you haven't looked there, grab those, maybe just open them up in a separate window so you can refer to them later. And we'll try to include links to some of this in the The content we'll share with you afterwards. You'll receive an email from DonorSearch with a link to a recording of this session. Don't leave because of that. But anyway, also it will include some information that we're sharing here now in the chat. We'll certainly be trying to do that. So, it strikes me, Tim, as you're talking about this, maybe it's not that different from a profile. Hopefully we're not all in profile business anymore, but to a certain degree, we have to, inform opinions about people, whether or not they're a good fit for us and we are for them. And we might be looking at 100 or 200 pages of data to boil it down to a small thing which is digestible by our colleagues. And so one version of that is it's condensation, but another one is it's synthesis and analysis and recommendation. So when it comes to this kind of stuff, especially now that it's a one-person shop and it's probably reactive and proactive, how much do you lean into recommendation?
I lean into recommendation a lot because of where I sit, literally, reporting to the major gift team. I feel like I'm able to make recommendations in a more expedited way, and to feel like I'm part of the team and not kind of in the back office or whatever other awful analogy some people have used about prospect development, the B players and such. I've heard it all. And I think as these technologies change and nonprofits adapt them, I really hope that prospect development's status changes with it, and it's viewed as those strategic partners that we already are.
So do we, to go back to maybe the first thing you were talking about then, do we in effect make ourselves those more effective strategic partners by just going ahead and raising our hands and doing the thing?
In my experience, yes, because I think that has demonstrated to my leadership that I'm engaging with content that is out in the fundraising community that is valued, it's trusted. I've kicked the tires on it a bit, and I'm sharing with them what I think the most important takeaways are. And I think getting back to the imposter syndrome piece of our conversation, I think there is a built-in level of trust even before I got to Weber State, because of where I came from. Even though for me it felt like an imposter syndrome, they view it as, oh, he served on NEDRA and an APRA board, like he's very engaged. And for me, like when I started out with those affiliations, I thought, what am I doing here? But other people view it in a different light, and that is very motivating and encouraging. And that has gone a good way to where I am now to say, hey, my boss, let's have 30 minutes to talk about this, because we have a built-in trust. Some of that is based on my career path, and let's dive into this. I think we all have various fears of what it means for our job security, what it means for our core responsibilities, who we are as professionals. I think just like imposter syndrome, you just, if you feel like it, that it's a thing for you, go ahead and do it anyway. So go ahead and have that meeting. And Sarah Anello, I just love this in the chat, kind of want to start a recovering imposter syndrome crew. That is awesome.
I love that too. In fact, I was going to say, maybe what we need is the opposite, that if in fact providing information is helpful to people, but it doesn't necessarily get them to feel confident and take action. But if we project confidence, often people feel that confidence, and then they feel confident to go and take action based on our recommendations.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if instead of the imposter syndrome, which we're all talking about, we all agree with, many of us feel, if we need to have some other kind of syndrome, like I don't know, confidence syndrome or something, just to countermand this ridiculous thing that we do to ourselves, and
Yes.
and unintentionally then do to the people we're working with. Because if we just could project a little more confidence, it might help them to be a little bolder too.
Oh, yes. Yes, I love that. And I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Well, as we're getting, I know, almost to the hour. So if you were to kind of think about what are the main learnings that you've encountered as you think about these issues, and as you're starting to talk to others about it, like you're talking with us today, are there 1, 2, or 3 things that you would say, these are things that we absolutely need to do so we can advance these lessons?
Yeah, I think a couple things from the slide deck. One of my takeaways here is that career trajectories can fluctuate, and to be okay with that. And what I mean by that is, in my experience, going from a sizable, well-resourced team to a smaller team, but managing that team, which I didn't have earlier, to now being the one person contributor. At some point, Jay, I have no qualms about this. Someone much younger than me will be my manager on a prospect development team. And I won't be the sole advocate for what I'm hearing and reading about in the industry. I wanted to share this. I mean, the Beatles did Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band the very same year. It was a phenomenal, groundbreaking record. The very same year they put out the Magical Mystery Tour, which was a movie soundtrack. Very different. You think of this groundbreaking album, and then they follow it up with a much different album that was very not well received. But yet then they come back the next year with the White Album. And so, we're going to have peaks and troughs, hills and valleys in our careers. But I think, one of the takeaways is just to do it anyway and to embrace that change. That gets to that recovering imposter syndrome that Sarah mentioned. And I think another thing is just to lean into your curiosities.
Yeah.
That stood you well in your career, and I think for me as well, like it's a very uplifting, motivating element to the work I do, is just to find out what I'm curious about on a donor, or how to move the needle on an initiative for a college at Weber State with the gift officers. The other thing that I loved, I won't share it, I'll just read it quickly here. It's from Arthur Brooks, social scientist. Has a podcast, writes to The Atlantic, and it resonates with me. And he said, devote the back half of your life to serving others with your wisdom. Get old sharing the things you believe are most important. And as everyone gets older and their careers go on, there'll be fresh energy coming up behind us, but there's still a lot that we can contribute. It's our experience, it's our curiosity, it's our talent and expertise. And I love that. I think that's very encouraging for our futures if we adopt that mindset. So
that's a beautiful sentiment. It's very well stated. Thank you for all of this, Tim. Really do appreciate it. If people want to, first of all, listen to your podcast, where do they find it? And then where can they find out more about you and be in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jay. Podcast interviews are on my website, peopleinfundraising.com. You can find me, on LinkedIn. I'm not the only Tim Wilson in the world. So maybe a little tricky to find me on LinkedIn, but happy to reach out there. Also, peopleinfundraising@gmail.com is my email address for that project. So And
Thank you
thank
for
you
that.
to all of the attendees today. And Jay, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. So I appreciate you thinking of me.
No, it's a pleasure. Really like what you're doing, as well as everything you shared today. And I want to encourage everybody to give a listen to the interviews you're doing, because they're not only very valuable to the listener, but it's also great to see the people you're putting in front of us who have not had a suitable stage before, and that's all because of you.
Thank you.
So with that, I want to thank everybody for being here with us live, or for those listening to the recording later. I hope you've just enjoyed this little session. All of these sessions, of course, are recorded and then placed in the library over in YouTube, which is a wonderful resource that's very hard to manage, actually, in some respects, but also at the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net, where you can find all this in different categories, or you can always reach out to me. My email address at DonorSearch is it's my first name, Jay, at donorsearch.net. But you can also find me on LinkedIn or wherever else you want to look on the internet. And more importantly, you're going to receive an email with a link to this recording so you can share it with colleagues, which I hope you'll do, because all the things we've talked about are not unique to us sitting in this virtual space. They're also occurring with your colleagues and friends. They'd probably benefit from hearing about this as well. I also want to make sure and encourage you to take a look perhaps at some of the content that'll be in these links along the chat before we close up today, and a QR code you're going to see as we close out our cameras, to take a look for that, if you will. If you are interested in AI, DonorSearch, which is our sponsor for all this content, does have a real AI service. There is a brain within DonorSearch that's built by people like Nathan Chappell. So if you are interested in this, you don't have to buy the service, but it probably would be interesting to take a look at that thing. And the only way to do that is to just look at that little QR code with your phone right now, and then take a look at that service. I'm sure you'll find it at least of interest to you, because everybody in this room, once again, is curious, and we all want to know where this is going, and it's not just Chat GPT. So you might want to take a look at that and compare it to other things in the marketplace. With that, I want to thank you all, and I want to thank you also for being here throughout this part of the year. We're taking a 2-week break as I cross the Pacific. So I may be recording a little bit as I have been here in Japan, and sharing that with you when I'm done. But in the meantime, you'll be taking a break from great people like Tim, and definitely from me. So enjoy that break. And then please come back in 2 weeks when we have a whole bunch of great guests. You don't want to miss it. And if you're not on this list, once again, you can email me or write me at LinkedIn, or you can just sign up for the list at DonorSearch. Don't be afraid. They're very nice people. It's donorsearch.net. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Till then, take care, stay healthy. We'll see you soon. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone.